Now available in paperback and e-readers, Isis, Amari's Revenge. The goddess next door is confronted by a Nubian queen out for revenge at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in this inaugural Isis series adventure. Get your copy of Isis, Amari's Revenge in paperback and e-readers at Amazon.com and online booksellers everywhere. Better get the coleslaw, y'all, cause we're having us a barbecue. One of the things that I find quite interesting about the comic book industry is its denial of the racism that goes on behind the scenes. Now, when it comes to the comic book industry, it's clear to me that there is a denial of the racism that goes on behind the scenes as related to hiring, and a denial of the white privilege that many employees have at big companies like Marvel and DC. Now, a lot of people will look at the window dressing of the campaigns such as the all-new, all-different Marvel and look at it and believe that there is an effort being made to add more so-called diversity to comics. But when we look at that whole window dressing, it was just a passive-aggressive plan to try to show people why they needed to maintain the status quo. Because with that all-new, all-different Marvel, you still had the same white managers in place, and the same white managers were basically creating comics that featured minority characters like Miles Morales' Spider-Man, Riri Williams' Ironheart, the Sam Wilson Captain America, the Jane Foster Thor, and the Amadeus Cho Hulk in an effort to push so-called diversity passively, but aggressively what they were looking to do was create a campaign where these whole characters they knew were going to fail when they were introduced into the mainstream, so that they could go back to the status quo of failure that has been the standard for the comic book industry for the last 30 years under white male and white female leadership. Now, what I find to be the most interesting thing about the whole comic book industry is that many of these white men and women basically have been failing for almost 3 decades, and as they have been failing for 3 decades, they basically don't see the white privilege that they have been given to be able to keep their jobs in comics. Now, I remember a time when entertainment like comics was very competitive, and I remember a time when comic creators like Jim Shooter, again a white man, was held to an extremely high standard, and even he wanted to make high standards for comics. And the sad part is that even though Jim Shooter wanted to establish some sort of standard, many of these same comic creators basically worked to undermine him in 1987, worked to undermine him even though he was working towards helping artists be able to maintain their art, get their art back, able to get some sort of health care, was looking out for them, but they basically threw him out because basically, as I see it, they wanted to maintain all of the goodies, giveaways, and guarantees that they got under the white supremacist system that was a part of comics where they didn't have to have any sort of accountability whatsoever. I mean, when we look at the era of Jim Shooter, basically this man was fired in 1987, fired basically because of the people like John Byrne, again, burning him in effigy, and the company got upset and fired him for something he didn't even do. But these days, we've got many of these same comic people who've been in this industry for 20, 30, 40 years and have been failing regularly. And these people, as they have been failing regularly, were able to keep their jobs for an extended period of time. And that's what really boggles my mind. Jim Shooter, a man who basically, again, managed to bring the comic book industry to a point where Marvel was the #1 comic book company, was fired after 9 years of good service. But people who have been failing in this industry for 20, 30 years are allowed to keep their jobs and have been allowed to keep their jobs mainly because they are white, That's the only reason I can say that these guys were allowed to keep their jobs. I mean, when I look at the disastrous run of Dan Didio at DC Comics, I mean, here's a guy who basically took a comic book company that was doing well with many books selling 200, 300,000 copies, and basically drove it down to the point where near the end of before the New 52, many of those books were struggling to sell maybe 50, 60,000 copies. And this man, after making numerous changes to the DC universe that were detrimental to the entire comic book line, this man was allowed to stay on the job from 2002 all the way up until I'd say about 2016, and basically, again, stayed in that job after running the entire DC Comics line straight into the ground. And again, this would not have happened in the 1980s. No, wouldn't have happened in the 1980s, because if you failed back then, basically you were out the door and you were considered again to be fired at that point. But Dan Didio managed to stay at DC Comics for again over a decade, ran the entire business straight into the ground, and many people won't see it as the white privilege that this man actually had. I mean, this man basically was allowed to stay in a job for over a decade, failing for an entire decade, when, again, as someone who studied the entertainment industry for over 25 years, I've watched as executives get bounced at TV stations and publishing houses because they couldn't get the sales up in a year or 2 years. But this man managed to stay in a job, and again, that shows you the white privilege many have in the comic book industry. And another example of this is Marvel Comics editor Tom Brevoort. I mean, this man has been basically at this job for close to 30 years, and Marvel's sales continue to drop under him. I mean, Marvel's sales continue to drop like a rock. And again, any other person would have been fired many years ago, back in about 2010 or so, when Marvel really started to drop after Civil War. But this guy manages to keep a job, and keeps a job, and is continuing to run Marvel straight into the ground. Again, if that's not white privilege, I don't know what is. And then I'll go into the comic creators who keep fumbling the ball, like your Brian Michael Bendis, your Gail Simone, and many others. Many of these creators have been, again, making failed series after failed series, failed reboot after failed reboot, and nobody ever says, hey, it's time for these people to go and to bring new people in. No, in the comic book industry, these same white creators continue to get jobs, making the same exact books, and the editors there basically expect a different result. Now, the rest of the world calls this the definition of insanity, but in white supremacy, when it comes to white privilege, if you're white, you can fail, and if you are the right kind of white person, because Jim Shooter wasn't the right kind of white person, that's what baffles me, but proves, again, a point about racism. I mean, Jim Shooter, basically, a white man, had this thing running right, but he wasn't the right kind of white person. But these white people basically can sit here and fail constantly over time, and will constantly, again, continue to get jobs, and people will sit there and say, oh, this is just the comic book industry, but this is the white privilege that goes on, the white privilege that these individuals have, because, again, in a true system of merit, people who constantly fail would not be allowed to continue to get jobs. But in the system of white supremacy, those white people who fail constantly, they can continue to get jobs because they're white. And because they're white, they are allowed to fail and continue to collect a paycheck, because we can't have those white folks, again, being without paychecks. No, they gotta be able to pay their bills, but there's no penalty for those white people when they go out here and fail. But they'll sit there and say, you know, we don't want any of those black creators or any of those non-black creators in their industry because they feel that they are going to mess up. That's what some of these racists in editorial will sit there and possibly say, "Oh, I don't want that black creator on this book." But the whole thing is that had you had a competent black creator, they may have been able to, do a better job with that comic than the current white person who you've had in this job for over 20 years and can't get any sort of traction. No, I mean, with the Dan Didiots, the Tom Brevoorts, the Gail Simones, and many of these others, again, we've had these individuals in this industry for over 20 years, and the sales ain't really reflecting positively. We're not seeing the 250, 300,000 we saw under Jim Shooter. No, we're seeing books drop all the way into the 10,000s at the best as related to sales, but everything is considered to be A-okay for many of these racists in denial. No, they don't want to go out here and acknowledge the success of a guy like Eric July. And I don't like Eric July. He's a bootlick in my eyes, but he can go out here and at least get some decent sales. I mean, 15,000. Yeah, that's not even an apartment building in the Bronx, but it's better sales than many people. And many of the white people don't like Eric July because he basically beat them at their own game. And they don't like him only because he knew how to sell comics. And again, just like Jim Shooter, you don't like the guy who sells comics, but the people who fail, you want to keep them in the job. You want to keep them in the job. And again, don't want to acknowledge that white privilege. Don't want to acknowledge that white privilege you're giving someone, because that's what white privilege is. Again, you can continuously fail and still keep your job, and no business, again, that's really, functional is going to do that at all. No, if you're not going out here and meeting the standards as related to the business and not generating revenue, what the bosses do is, again, take you in the office, sit down and say, the sales ain't coming in as related to what you're presenting. The numbers just aren't there. You're not really producing what we need. And I'm sorry, but I'm going to have to let you go. And I'm going to have to bring in somebody who can basically bring in the numbers. But that's not the standard for the comic book industry. No, not the standard at all. And many of these individuals, again, they talk about how they're left-leaning, but can't see how they're enjoying the privilege that white racists give to themselves. I mean, this is no different than the goobers down south who basically go out here and, again, can't do a job but are given a job by the racists down south because they want a white man in the job. And because they want the white man in the job, it's not about him being the best qualified for the job. And that's the reason why they're hired, is because they're white. And again, the same thing is going on with the left-leaning comic industry. The same thing is going on. Again, we don't get to see talented black creators. Yeah, they'll go out here and, again, do what the people do with affirmative action. Go out here and get a Vita Ayala or one of these other creators like a Ta-Nehisi Coates. Again, watch them passively get hired and then aggressively set them up for failure. Again, set those people up for failure and, again, keep hiring them because they want them to fail. And again, this all fits into what I talk about as related to agendas. Again, when they hire a black person, they hire them for an agenda. This is where they hire a Vita Ayala or a Ta-Nehisi Coates, but won't hire a Sean James because, again, they don't want to really compete. And again, that's the thing that's been killing the comic book industry. We've got a lot of comfortable, complacent people who, again, are comfortable with failure and don't want to compete like Jim Shooter used to do. I mean, Jim Shooter basically was a competitor. He wanted to be the best, and he wanted to make the best comics. But those who love white privilege, they don't want to be the best. No, that's a part of white supremacy. Again, they want the goodies, giveaways, and guarantees of being given guaranteed jobs that they're allowed to have, even though they fail. And they want to be able to work at these companies and continue to fail regularly at the job. and again, be able to keep a job even though they fail. And that's something that, again, shows the white privilege that goes on with the folks who say that they're woke, and shows us how, yeah, they're really not woke. No, they're just as racist as those on the right, and shows us how nothing has really changed about work in the comic book industry in America. Now, if you want to check out my first full comic, John Haynes at Death's Door, you can find that comic on Lulu.com in paperback, and you can pick it up for the same price as a 2022 Kickstarter. And if you want to check out my other comic, Esteem No Good Deed, you can find that comic on Kindle for 99 cents, and you can also find it in the back of the Esteem series book, Esteem Blast from the Past. And if you want to see a universe of really cool characters, you can check out my books in the SJS Direct universe. You can find those books in paperback and Kindle format on Amazon.com, and you can find it in digital format at other online booksellers like Draft the Digital, Google Play, Barnes & Noble, and big box retailers like Walmart and Target. And if you want to see me take the comic book industry to the barbecue, you can drop a donation to the Patreon, the PayPal, and or the Cash App by clicking the link in the description box. That's all I have to say for this video. You can comment, rate, and subscribe. Now available on Lulu, John Haynes at Death's Door. The man who rules the world takes on the Greek god of death in this action-packed, all-new John Haynes comic book. Get your copy of the first John Haynes comic at Lulu.com today. Now available in paperback and e-readers, Esteem Horror in the Hamptons. The aspiring angel tries to escape a house of horrors in this action-packed, all-new Esteem series adventure. Get your copy of Esteem Horror in the Hamptons in paperback and e-readers at online booksellers everywhere. Now available in paperback and e-readers, Isis, Dark Incubus. The goddess next door gets enthralled in a romantic entanglement with an evil incubus in this all-new Isis series adventure. Get your copy of Isis, Dark Incubus in paperback and e-readers today. Support Black-owned and Black-operated digital broadcast media. www.niceradionetwork.com. Nice Radio Network, broadcasting 24 hours a day, 7 days a week.